Hello, AP World History. This is Mrs. Pritchard, and we are going to get into Chapter 32, Western Society in Eastern Europe in the Decades of the Cold War. Aren't you excited to do this at home? I'm so excited too. First off, you're going to do the map. If you don't have time here to read all the questions and write the answers down in your notebook, then go ahead and access the PowerPoint from Canvas, Unit 7, 8, and 9, Chapter 32, PowerPoint. You can get to all of it. So, post-World War II, life was hard. Railroads and roads had to be rebuilt. There were ill-fed people. Europe was basically pretty much a mess. The colonies were not very good, and any better, really. Europe tried to restore colonial administration. They wanted to possibly hold colonies by force, some preferred to grant independence because the cost was not worth it. This is mostly going to be Great Britain. Western nations did retain ties to former colonies, like cultural, military, and economic ties. France had issues. Vietnam and Algeria, there was pretty bitter fighting. And with the loss of colonies, we're going to see Europe's power in the world reduced. Into this then comes the Cold War. We've talked a little bit about the Cold War already. Pressure from the U.S. For internal and foreign policy. Europe is aided by the U.S., so they're really pushing to kind of stay democratic, at least in the Western Europe. U.S. troops in Europe had nuclear weapons now to protect them from the USSR, especially places like Germany and Turkey. And Europe was pretty resilient. It was an extension of democracy. Inter-European rivalries change because Eastern Europe really isn't part of this anymore. And we're going to see new economic growth that was really helped along by the United States and the Marshall Plan. So Europe can keep their military budgets low and let the United States handle their military needs and their protection. This helped European countries gain more economically, which is what the United States knew that kind of the world needed and the world did need to go ahead and recover from World War II. So there's definitely a spread of liberal democracies. West Germany was France. Remember France, Great Britain, and the United States sectors. And Germany is going to kind of bring about what were known as the Christian Democratic Movement. So moderate social reform. This is Angela Merkel. She looks a little different than this picture now. She has been the Chancellor of Germany for quite a while, and she will be retiring here in the next year or so. But she has really led Germany in the 21st century. So by the 1980s, Western Europe is basically all democratic. The war had discredited fascism. Even Spain is no longer fascist by 1975. But they involve a lot of government planning and welfare activity. So these countries are mostly what we call welfare states, and that they would benefit all classes. The idea was to end social inequality. Now, the thing with this is going to be there will be higher taxes, but that does also reduce the impact of economic equality. There's medical assistance. There are unemployment benefits. In most Western European countries, you are going to see healthcare is nationalized, so there's government healthcare. There's government housing. There's a lot of government planning, like in taxes, agriculture, economic planning. So the role of the state increases, but it also brings about political stability. So you see some pretty conservative governments that support existing programs. But the biggest thing here is that the role of the state grows. Now we see a little bit more, protest going on. Civil rights movements, student protests. In the United States, we're going to see the civil rights movement, as well as protests against the war in Vietnam. You see a feminism and environmentalism movements. A lot of students, their goals were less materialism, had very idealistic goals. But you also see reforms and continuity of prosperity. Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Ronald Reagan, President of the United States in the 80s, actually tried to lessen the welfare state to create more economic growth and focus on economic, not social issues. They did that to some extent, but Britain still basically is a welfare state, whereas the United States basically has not been. Um, there's a lot of work to curtail nationalistic rivalries. So the European Economic Community becomes the European Union. The EEC started out as West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And then will grow to become the European Union, which has some 20-some states in it now. They're looking for harmony within Europe. And again, the Marshall Plan is helping economically. And the West is basically free from major political upheavals than the rest of the world. And that's going to stay. It still basically is. There have been some issues like in Yugoslavia when it broke up. But most of the time, it is very stable politically. As we look at some economic expansion, and the idea was to tie German expansion to the international framework so the German strength wouldn't threaten Europe. So agriculture productivity is really good. Productivity increases. There's lots of technological change, which shows good economic growth. There's more immigration to Western Europe, and that's needed because they need workers. They don't have enough workers. Their populations are too small. So they bring in, like in Germany, they bring in a lot of guest workers from Turkey. And economic growth, low unemployment equals income improvement. So the taxes aren't as bad because your income is going up also. The service sector grows very quickly. So the nurses, the retail clerks, the lawyers, anybody who basically doesn't actually work with their hands to produce something is the service sector. You see a lot more affluency, so people doing better economically. You see more disposable income. So Western Europe basically by the end of the 20th century or middle of the 20th century is in very good shape. Now, the Cold War is still going on and will go on till the 1980s. The Allies basically shift. You can see that Canada, Australia, and New Zealand shift from Great Britain to the United States. There are similar economic, political, and social trends. So the U.S. is basically a superpower, along with the Soviet Union at this time, and they're going to lead foreign policy with that decline of Britain. Remember, the United States has a massive military, and that's going to help with this. So these are all former dominions. Canada follows kind of Europe and the United States. There are issues with Quebec and it wanting independence. They have actually voted a couple of times. Independence has never passed, but they have gotten more kind of rights for the French. Remember, Quebec is basically was French based, and now everything in Quebec basically has to be dual language. So you can see, in the picture, the stop sign, the no parking signs, menus, toothpaste tubes, shampoo bottles, everything basically is dual language. So that kind of helped Quebec feel a little better about it. Canada follows the U.S. More. There is some backlash at home. Remember NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was just canceled, and a new one has come out basically between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Australia and New Zealand are the U.S. alliances in the Pacific. Those countries will actually back the United States in Korea and in the Vietnam War. There's a little bit more distance now because about 20 years ago, New Zealand decided that no more nuclear powered vessels could enter ports in New Zealand. So they're no longer, United States ships basically cannot dock in New Zealand because especially the big ones are all nuclear powered, and New Zealand won't allow that. A lot of immigration into Australia, especially Asians. So you see Australia becoming a much more diverse country, and also exporting more to Asia instead of just to kind of Great Britain and the United States. So Asia becomes much more of a partner with the Asian countries. The idea that the 20th century was the United States century is kind of there. United States was and is considered a superpower, kind of taking on the mantle of leadership within the world. Um, the quote is that it's the world's leading defender of democratic and capitalist values. So we see a lot of movement with things like the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine basically said that the United States will support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. So basically, it means that it's against any kind of communist pressure. It's created because you've got domestic pressure, or excuse me, communist pressure on Greece and Turkey. So you see here the Russian bear, and this is a Greek soldier. And Russia was putting a lot of pressure on Greece and Turkey, basically to ally with Russia. Then we get into things like Korea. Remember, the Korean War started in 1950. The split Korea was created by World War II, not by um, the Korean War. And in the Korean War, if you can see the infographic, it shows that the North invaded the South, and then the U.S. and the South pushed back and actually invade the North there in 1951. And as they move farther into the north, you're going to see that China is going to join kind of the fight and help the Koreans. And then with that, the North will then again push back the South. And the whole thing will basically end at the same place it started, at the 38th parallel. Today, Korea is still split, North Korea. Um, is that communist dictatorship. It is still split at the 38th parallel. That's the demilitarized zone. And basically, the war hasn't ended. There has been no peace treaty for the Korean War. They keep trying to kind of get together again, and it really has not happened. Then you end up in the 1960s. The CIA is going to be a very big part of what goes on. It's basically worldwide gathering information. So the CIA is basically gathering information from other countries, whereas the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, gathers information from within the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, early 70s, we get the Vietnam War. This is really a very famous picture. The United States had just dropped napalm, which basically burns everything. So she had, torn her clothes off because they were burning her. She's actually a really good motivational speaker now, this little girl. This was a very famous picture that was on the cover of a whole lot of magazines at the time. So the United States is considered a superpower. A lot of military spending, huge amounts of military spending in the United States. Start to see being involved in regional conflicts like Vietnam, in the Middle East, in Latin America. The idea of the U.S. containment policy, that basically don't let communism grow. So they did not want communism to grow. It ends up being too much in Vietnam, which we'll talk about in another chapter. But there's a lot of domestic pressure against the war in Vietnam. There was not that pressure against the war in Korea. So it's kind of interesting how things changed between the 50s and 60s, and the United States, basically the United States people being more involved in kind of what the government was doing. So in the 70s, then we end up with an oil crisis. competition from East Asia. With that, the the OPEC countries, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, will cut production and raise prices. These are mostly Middle Eastern countries, although Venezuela is one also. And they're going to, like I say, cut production, raise prices, mostly because of what was going on in Palestine. So you're going to see, actually, I can remember waiting in a line to get gas in the 70s. And all the cars were big, and you weren't always able to get gas. You had to be very careful about what you used and how often that you drove. Um, it's going to bring about a recession in the 1970s. The government's going to pull back on welfare. There's going to be higher unemployment. Um, all Western societies, like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, North America, are considered advanced industrial societies now. So a lot of differences were gone among them. Education, unskilled jobs were filled by immigrants, strong middle classes. Economic growth basically eased social conflict. Family leisure increased. Um, this is a picture of probably the most famous store in Great Britain. This is number 10 Downing Street. This is where the Prime Minister lives in London. And they have, as the Prime Minister, it's a good picture because it shows an immigrant basically cleaning in front of 10 Downing Street. So immigrants are going to be very important for those lower level jobs. The idea, though, that not everybody is welcoming to immigrants, you can see in the political cartoon, door wide open but very high up. So there were immigration problems earlier as well as in the last 5 years in Canada, in Europe. Then we start to see a women's revolution. So women start to enter the workforce. They mostly with service jobs, so not working in, some will work in factories, but mostly service jobs. They're getting higher education. They're adding to the family income. There's much more access to divorce, which actually often leads to poverty with women because their jobs don't pay as much as their former husbands did, and they may not get alimony to help them with that. So it actually, divorce often led to problems with women and economics. Obviously, you had the women's vote in 1920, the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s that was supposed to be a constitutional amendment that gave women, equal status with men in everything. It did not pass. It passed Congress, but did not pass the required number of states. It's kind of interesting because it has been brought up again, and they're talking about maybe trying to pass this amendment again. Literally, it's come up in the last couple of months. Birth control, fewer children. Women can decide when they're going to have children and how many they do have. New roles, women in the military. The United States is easing up on its women in combat. They may ease up on the fact that women may be able to be drafted soon. So new families role, new family roles that, new earnings gap between men and women is a problem, like I said, rising divorce rates, rejection of a purely domestic role. Now, I want you to look at this picture and kind of think of how this is something you would not have seen earlier. And look at where she's from. She's from Indonesia, which is a majority Muslim country. And there she is competing in a beauty pageant in a bikini. Not really a common thing in Muslim countries. But that kind of shows the movement of women. So Western culture, we're going to see a lot of new ideas. Science is extremely strong. We're going to have intellectuals moving to the United States from Europe. So kind of some of the innovation in science moves towards the United States because it's expensive and Europe can't afford it. Albert Einstein, obviously, he comes to the United States. DNA is discovered. And the whole idea of genetics behind DNA and being able to map DNA And that's going to be done by someone from Britain as well as someone from the United States. You start to see art films, and Europe is going to lead in that. Many of them are realistic, not as much commercialism. Modern art. The book talks about Henry Moore, and he was British, liked very, very rounded things, saying that it conveyed the horrors of war and the post-war dislocation. And there's going to be a growing public acceptance of modern styles. Popular culture, Americanization. Some of the things gets really interesting. TV shows will travel all around the world, and stop and think about some of the American TV shows you watch, and think of how foreigners would see that as actually American, and that's what America is like. One of the best examples of this is that in the 1980s, there were two kind of nighttime soap operas called Dallas and Dynasty, and they were about people who lived in Texas, were involved in the oil industry, were extremely rich. The women in the show were dripping in diamonds. They had a huge house. They had tons of cars, and they were all fancy cars. And this went to other countries, and other people are watching this and thinking this is what the United States is like. When I was in the Middle East in the early 80s, they would literally ask me, well, what kind of cars do you have? And I'd be like, I have this little Mazda. And they're like, but what about your other cars? And I'm like, that's the only car I have. And they couldn't understand that there was an American that only had one car when everything on TV was showing them that they had multiple cars. So that, the whole idea of popular culture moving to other places in the world. Ronald McDonald, that's in China. In the Middle East, McDonald's. Capitalism kind of coming, the idea of capitalism and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and restaurants and all those kinds of things. Then on the other hand, we have British music coming into the United States called the British Invasion. We're starting with ones like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And now today you're going to find so many different artists that are from so many different countries, but still followed here in the United States and followed in other countries. Madonna is very popular everywhere. So you start to see ideas with social history. You start to see economics. You start to see massive data collection, economic cycles, money supply. So a lot of changes in this time period in the lives of ordinary people and how they live. One of the other things that I always think about are jeans. Jeans were literally invented in the West by Levi Strauss during the 1800s, mostly for the gold rush in California. And they were heavy material. They washed well. They lasted really well. So jeans became very uniquely American. Well, you go anywhere in the world today and you see jeans. They're worn everywhere. You could actually, if you could smuggle them into the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, you could sell them for huge amounts of money because they didn't allow Levi's in the country. So jeans have become, they're iconically American, but now they're everywhere. Although it's interesting to see, you can always tell in Europe who the American tourists are because they're wearing their jeans with tennis shoes. And Europeans wear them with heels and sandals and dressy shoes. You don't really see them very often with tennis shoes. So the idea of the superpower, or two superpowers at this point, with the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union is really working on heavy industry and weapons development. Both the Soviet Union and the United States have nuclear power and a worldwide influence. Some of that is going to be, these are actually Soviet missiles. This is at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. In Eastern Europe, it's an extension of the Soviet sphere. So Eastern Europe is not seeing all this movement forward in economics. What they are seeing is being basically run by the USSR. So they're very hard hit by agricultural problems. They're still very agricultural. They're hard hit by the Depression. There's some German control, especially in East Germany. And East Germany would basically kind of control some of those other areas right near them. Um, so Eastern Europe had been under Nazi control, then the Soviets invade. And you saw a lot of rivalries among Eastern European nations that weakened them. Many of them will be new nations. The end of World War II, like I said, that Soviet offensive and Soviet control. All but Greece and Yugoslavia will be part of the Warsaw Pact. Yugoslavia, remember, is still communist, but Marshal Tito refuses to kind of go along with Stalin, so he's kind of communist all on his own. There will be some internal protests, some experimenting with more liberal regimes. They're basically going to be put down and crushed, especially Hungary and Czechoslovakia in the 50s and 60s. This is actually Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin died. So they're following the Soviet lead of communism. They're atheist. They followed collectivization. They follow industrialization. In the 70s, there is some lessening of control. In Poland, there's a labor union called Solidarity. So it's a labor movement. And they start pushing, it starts in the Gdansk shipyards by a gentleman named Lech Walesa. And they start basically pushing for more freedoms. One of the things that's a little different about Poland is that the Catholic Church was still kind of involved in people's everyday lives. Communism basically is atheist, but the Soviets kind of let Poland keep a lot of their Catholicism, and that's going to move people more towards, pushing for a lessening control from the Soviets. And that the need for the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe basically kept them from other parts of the world. So the USSR at this point is pretty isolated. The Cold War in the USSR, that fear of it led to acceptance of their state authority. So it was pushed, a fear of a new war that the USA aggressiveness is going to threaten. So in the Soviet Union, they're telling their people that, the United States is going to attack and we're going to be in trouble and they're trying to take us over and it's terrible. And the United States are telling people the same thing about the Soviet Union. So it goes back and forth. Party members are only about 6% of the population, so not that many people are actually communist. They do a lot of education to train good citizens. Still a little bit behind. Culture is very secular. There's a war on religion in the Soviet Union. Art and literature is monitored, that it stays within the party line. This is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You'll read a source book on him. He was a very famous Soviet writer, and he wrote the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich that you'll read. And he actually was imprisoned in a Soviet gulag. Gulags were prisons in Siberia for what he wrote, because he wrote anti-Soviet government works, and they were smuggled out of the USSR to the West so they could be published. Eventually, the Soviet Union finally says, the West is putting pressure on them about, imprisoning an author, and they kick him out of the country. And he comes to the United States. He lives in Vermont, or he lived in Vermont. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell and communism was gone in Russia, he moved back because he missed Mother Russia and he hated the materialism in the United States. The West was too decadent for him. So very traditional classic music and ballet. Western culture is attacked. In fact, the ballet will be probably the best in the world out of the Soviet Union. Jazz and rock in the 80s was considered too decadent. So things like the Beatles music like that was not allowed in. People would try and smuggle little audio tapes of it. So, there was a black market for this kind of music. You had mass ceremonies like on May Day, which was basically having parades of all their military might. There were definitely limits on the church, but Muslims actually had a little more latitude. Most Muslims lived in the Central Asian area in here, which were Soviet republics, and they did get a little bit more latitude for being allowed to worship. Freedom of expression totally depended on the current leadership. Some of them were a little bit easier about it. Some of them were a little bit tougher about it, like Nikita Khrushchev was very tough about it, whereas Brezhnev was a little bit more easygoing about it. But patriotism and the Russian soul was really important. They literally call it Mother Russia. Emphasis on science, technology, and weaponry. So picture of Sputnik, which there was a big race, basically the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union as who could get a man in space first. The Soviet Union actually had a monkey in space first. Who could orbit the Earth first, which is going to be John Glenn. Who would get to the moon first, which was the United States. I mean, it was a really big push, what they called the space race. So the economy in the Soviet Union is totally state control. Heavy industry over consumer goods. By the 1950s, they were totally industrialized thanks to Stalin. A bit more freedom of expression after Stalin. But again, you know, we already talked about there were no consumer goods, or very, very few consumer goods. They really talked about socialist realism, you know, glorifying heroic workers and peasants and soldiers. There were some similarities to the West. Leisure habits were kind of the same. Very organized. They started to have a few incentives to work better, yet still things were not great. You know, you go swimming on the beach with a rusted hull of a ship nearby, a submarine passing by, although if you looked very carefully, this was a photoshopped on the internet, that submarines, it doesn't get that deep where you see the people versus the submarine. The submarine, it has to be a whole lot deeper for them. So you got to be careful what you look at the internet. Sports, films, TV, very similar to leisure in the West. A stronger division between workers and management in the Soviet Union. But they also had urbanization, declining birth rates, working women. So very similar to the West in these kinds of things. Women dominate medicine, like I've said before, and they worked heavy jobs like in construction. So de-Stalinization is going to start in 1953 when Stalin dies. And it's going to start with a ruling committee after his death. And then comes Nikita Khrushchev. And he is actually going to attack Stalinism and Stalin's narrow interpretation of Marxism. And after Khrushchev so there's a little bit of a softening of a political climate. Khrushchev was very bombastic. You can see in the picture, you know, he used his hands a lot. He's a very loud speaker, very good speaker. But after Khrushchev, kind of patterns remain constant and stagnant, lowers Cold War tensions a little bit, softening of the political climate, you know, still party control. One of the things that's going to be well remembered with Khrushchev is 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, the Soviet Union, Cuba was communist at this point from Fidel Castro. Soviet Union decides to send nuclear warheads to Cuba. John F. Kennedy is president of the United States. He says, no, you're not sending nuclear warheads to Cuba. Turn your ships around. Send them back. We don't want them, you know, this close. Cuba's 90 miles from Miami. Khrushchev's like, no, we're sending them. We're going to do this. Kennedy's like, no, you're not. And over 3 days, it was really very tense that it might turn into a hot war with nuclear weapons. Eventually, Khrushchev backed down, sent his ships back with his nuclear warheads back to the Soviet Union. What was really interesting at this point is that the United States had nuclear warheads at their air bases in Turkey. And look on a good map and you can see how close Turkey is to the Soviet Union. But the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War tensions are going to ease up after a little bit. So things aren't quite as contentious between the United States and the Soviet Union. So competition with the West is going to switch to the space in the arms race because of technical ability. Sports also, Olympics will be huge. I can remember seeing the East German women who looked like men, like the swimmers. They were so bulked up because they were all using steroids. But the Soviet runners and the East German swimmers and anyone who was part of the Soviet bloc basically won a lot of events in the Olympics because they were using steroids. And they really pushed the Olympics very, very hard. China still does this, that they would actually identify children at a young age. Maybe they're really fast when they're 6 years old. And then they take them and they put them in a special school and they work with them, and then they become world-class sprinters. So they work with them literally from the time that they are very young until it's time for something like the Olympics or the World Championships. There will be a rift between the Soviet Union and China, and that is mostly because when Stalin died, Mao thought he'd be the top communist, and Khrushchev's like, no, you're not. You don't even have the right kind of communism. So basically, the Soviet Union and China will split up and not be the allies that they were, which gives us two different kinds of communism between the large countries of Russia and China. Then the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan. Basically, they wanted to promote a friendly puppet regime. They get bogged down in Afghanistan, and it is called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They can't beat them. They can't take it over. And it literally, they start to have protests. People don't appreciate their young men going to die in the Afghani war, and eventually Afghanistan will have to pull out. But only after the Taliban really starts pushing back on them, and interestingly enough, the Taliban at this point will be supplied by the United States. And then eventually the Soviet Union leaves, and the Taliban turns on the United States and uses all those U.S. weapons against the Americans. So the mid-'80s in the Soviet Union is going to bring an economic crisis that will bring political change. Lack of consumer goods to buy, so why work? A lot of environmental damage like diseases and respiratory problems. Very high alcoholism, infant mortality, dissatisfaction of the youth. The high alcoholism was a response to strict controls and no consumer goods. People basically didn't work when they were at their jobs, so then there are even fewer consumer goods. So the Soviet Union is really going to come to a hard place in the 80s, which we'll talk about in another chapter. So thus, that's the end of chapter 32, Western Society in Eastern Europe in the decades of the Cold War.